Right, Yud Aleph and Aleph, 11a. Halfway down, about a little less than halfway down the page, about a third of the way down the page. We know Tamra, and the first one line is the Chotzer. Just a little bit of review from yesterday. The Mishnah spoke about two instances where somebody was chasing after a deer with a broken leg, and the owner of the field, the deer was walking through the owner's field, and the owner of the field says, I'd like to acquire that deer. The law is the owner of the field gets to keep the deer with the broken leg on it, and the guy chasing it does not get to keep it. However, if the deer's leg was fine, or the birds were able to fly, and somebody was chasing them, and the owner says, my field should acquire it, he does not acquire it, because presumably there's no way he can watch these things. Now, the Gemara began with the distinction between Chotzer HaMishtameres and Chotzer She'ena Mishtameres.
Those two being again.
If the field is watched,
yeah,
watched meaning it's watched or it's secured, whether that's secured by a guard or it's secured by a fence, then you can acquire anything in the field. It's called Kinyan Chotzer. However, if the field is not watched, then in order for you to acquire the item, you must be standing next to the field. If you're not standing next to the field, you don't acquire it in an unsecured field. So Gemara says, okay, we know Tamer the Chotzer She'ena Mishtameres Yom Tzad in Iloi. Where do we know of this distinction? That if the field is not secured, that if you stand next to the field, then you can acquire it. But if you don't stand next to the field, you don't acquire it. So Gemara is a very interesting proof. We go back to the laws of Omer, right? Of Shikha. Shikha is when you forget a bundle in the field. Now, how exactly did you forget the bundle? Okay, the Tanya we learned. A guy is standing in the city, and he says, I remember I remember that the bundle that I have in the field that the workers forgot. It shouldn't be forgotten. I'd like to come pick it up. I would think that does not qualify as shikha. In other words, I would think that you didn't forget it. Therefore, the verse states that it is shikha. Let's see the verse. You have to forget it in the field, but not in the city. So Gemara says, one second, hold on a second. Hagu Fakasha. The Brisa states, the Brisa states that even though you're standing in the city, it still is considered forgotten. You can forget a bundle while standing in the city. And then you bring a source that indicates to you that you have to forget it in the field, and if you forget it in the city, it does not qualify as shikha. It seems to be contradictory. Does that make sense? Okay, one second. I'm gonna have a shikha that you have to forget it in the field, not in the city. Or must be this is the explanation. If you're standing in the field, you're going with the workers. Okay, so you have to, in order for you to forget it, you have to have shechchuach me'ikra, meaning that you completely forgot about it initially. In other words, you were walking through the fields, cutting down bundles, and you forgot one. That qualifies as shekha. However, let's say you remembered about it. You said, I'm just going to leave it here. I will come back and get it. And then the workers forgot to come back and get it. That does not qualify as shekha. That does not qualify as shekha. My time. Why is that? Because since he's in the field, so therefore you have kinyan chotzer. He acquires the bundle in the field. And therefore, like we're saying, in an unsecured field, if you're standing in the field, you acquire what's in the field. And this supports the Gemara's contention. Aval be'ir, But if you're in a city, you're not next to the field. Even if he knew about it initially, but then later on the workers forgot about it, it does qualify as forgetting. My time because he's not next to the field that he should acquire it. And clearly the difference here is whether you're next to the field to acquire it, meaning in an unsecured field, if you're next to the field, you can acquire what's in the field through what we call kinyan chotzer. Okay, so Gemara says Mimai. Well, the Gemara is not convinced that this is actually the interpretation of the Brisa. Dil magzeres akasav hidi b'sadin have a shekha u'be'ir loy have a shekha. So the Gemara says as follows: maybe the reason why you need to, the reason why the laws of forgetting are different between the city and the field is nothing to do with the fact that there's a kinyan chotzer going on, but it has to do with the fact that you'd think that shikha, forgetting, is primarily takes place in the field and not in the city. So therefore, the verse needs to include the forgetting in the city as forgetting. So it's irrelevant to the point of kinyan chotzer. That's not a relevant question here. It's just about what are the laws of shikha. So the Gemara says no. Obviously, that's not the case. There's a prohibition to go back and collect the bundle that you forgot, and that includes forgetting even if you're in the city. So the Gemara says no. That verse actually tells me something else. There's a prohibition to actually. If you forgot a bundle in the field, you're prohibited to go back and get it. So Gemara says, what do you mean? Don't take it. Don't go back. To include forgetting in the city. So in other words, we already know that you can shikha would apply even if you forgot in the city, and therefore it must be the difference in the city and the field is the difference of kinyan chotzer. So Gemara says, no. We actually don't know shikha in the city. Why? Because actually the verse, as you're saying, the verse should have said lo yisikachenu instead of lo yisashuv. But yisashuv implies don't go back, meaning don't go back from wherever you are, even if you're in a city. Lo yisikachenu would imply just don't go back and take it. But actually, it had to say lo yisashuv, don't turn backwards. Why? Because we'll see, you actually have to turn backwards to forget. Let's explain. It's not like we learned. The guy's walking through the field and he forgets stuff. Whatever he forgets that's in front of him is not considered forgetting. He has to forget what's behind him. So the Torah needs to specifically invoke the word laisashav, don't return, meaning don't turn on your heels. Zak, 1 second. Shalakru yeshikha, shehu b'bal toshav. Zakal, kol shehu b'bal toshav, shikha, kol she'ene b'bal toshav, ene shikha. Meaning the prohibition to turn around is exactly that. You're prohibited from actually turning around and going to get it. And what we learned from there is that the obligation of shikha and the category of shikha only exists when you're prohibited to turn around. Meaning, if you forgot what's in front of you, so you don't turn around for that, then there's no prohibition of shikha. There's no even obligation of shikha. So clearly the verse here is not referring to forgetting in a city, but it's referring to sort of categorizing what the parameters of the laws of shikha are. So Amar Rashi Amar Kra L'Rabbi Shikha Seir. So Rashi explains that we already know includes Shikha Seir, meaning we already know that you can forget either in the field or in the city. And because of that, we have to understand what's the distinction between the rules of forgetting in the city and forgetting in the field. Why is it that forgetting in the field requires a higher level of forgetting, whereas forgetting in the city is a lower level of forgetting? The answer is explained by our Mishnah. If the field is unsecured and you're standing in the field, then you acquire everything in the field. And that's why when you're in the field, you need a higher threshold of forgetting. Because you're standing in the field, you acquire what's in your own fields. Okay. Now there's a bunch of opinions that agree to the previous interpretation. The scenario in the Mishnah with the guy running after the guy, one guy is chasing after the deer with a broken leg, and the other guy is in the fields. So the guy in the field is able to acquire the deer with the broken leg before the other guy reaches it, because he's standing next to the field and the field is unsecured. He has to be standing in the field. Rabbi Abba asked Ula, Mice is a story. Rabbi Gamliel was a Canim, Sheibam Besfina. Rabbi Gamliel and the elders, they were traveling on a boat. And Rabbi Gamliel realized that there was stuff at home he forgot to take off Ma'aser from. And the law is a righteous person does not leave stuff without having taken off Ma'aser.
Can he do it mentally or verbally from a distance if he has no other choice?
So this is what he tried to do. So Gamliel says he was traveling in a group with a bunch of elders. He says very simple. The Ma'aser Rishon that goes to a Levi, I'm taking it off. It should be in this corner, and it should be given to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua is a Levi. It's interesting that he gave it to a Levi, even though at that point he could have given it to a Kohen as well. During the Second Temple, Ma'aser Rishon was given to a Kohen as well. Okay, so what did he do? He rented him the space that was underneath that portion. So he says, "Look, all the what do you call it? The grain is in the silo, and I'm renting you the back, the back 4 feet. It's all yours. I'd like you to pay me rent for that space." So Yeshua gave Rabbi Gamliel some insignificant amount of money, gave him a quarter or something, and he rented the space. And by doing that, he acquired all the Ma'aser Rishon that Rabbi Gamliel was giving to him. So in other words, now the Ma'aser Rishon is in Rabbi Yeshua's possession, because he actually owns the land that's underneath. Got it? Yep. Okay. Similarly, the Isser, we'll get to it. The Isser Echad Sheni Asa Lama Nosan L'Akiva Ben Yosef. That year was a year of Ma'aser Ani, giving a tithe 10% to the poor. So he said, okay, well, Rabbi Kiva represents the poor people. He was a charity collector. So he says, okay, Rabbi Kiva, instead of getting the back right 4 feet, he gets the back left 4 feet. And Rabbi Kiva gave Rabbi Gamliel a quarter to rent the property that all his Ma'aser is now on. Okay, so the Gemara says the obvious question here. 1 second. Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Kiva, B'tzad Sadeh, Shor Gamliel, Hayu Oimdim. Were Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Kiva next to the field? Obviously not. They were traveling in the oceans, in a distant place, and yet we still find that the kinyan that they did, which was kinyan chatzar, it worked even though they weren't standing next to the fields. You have what's presumably an unsecured property, at least with regard to Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Kiva, this is unsecured, and they acquire something with kinyan chatzar because the stuff is now in their domain, even though they're not standing next to their fields.
So you can transcend space. Can you also transcend time?
What does that mean?
With what they're doing.
I'm not sure.
Well, like they're saying we're not physically there right now, but we are.
But
I'm renting you this space where this stuff is.
And right? Most people, when they rent a house, they're not in the house and they rent it.
Say again.
When you rent a house, are you in the house? Are you in the house when you rent it? You sign a rental contract before you go in the house.
We're not talking about Ma'aser though, right? When we're renting a house.
The idea is that that Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yosef rented the space. Now all the Ma'aser is in their space because they rented the space that was underneath the Ma'aser, and now they acquire the Ma'aser with kinyan chatzar. The fact that the Ma'aser is in their property. There's just one problem: this property isn't secured, and they're not standing next to it. And it's the Brisa seems to imply that the kinyan works. Okay, well, it doesn't, and why not? It's not a good proof. Amar Lei, anyway, so Ula says to Rababo, he says, Domi Haimer Rabbanon Ketuli Gamri in Shishmaitza. This scholar, Rababo, he seems to be someone who isn't well learned. And that was his response. He didn't even bother explaining to him why he was wrong. Kiyasel Surah, when he went to Surah, Amar Lo Hachi Amar Ula. V'hachi Esvinu. He said, this is what Ula said. This was the question, and I don't have an answer. So one of the scholars explained to him why he was wrong. He said, Rabbi Gamliel was not using kinyan chotzer, he was using kinyan agav. Okay, let's explain. What is kinyan agav? If anyone remembers from Mesechus Kedushin, I'll actually go with the original, the classical example of agav is actually a verse. Their father is a very wealthy family. Their father wanted to give them a tremendous inheritance of wine and gold. So he gave the inheritance to them by giving them property in Yehudah. In Ori B'tzuris Yehudah. He gave them fortified cities in Yehudah. By acquiring the fortified cities, they acquired the movable items as well. It's a kinyan called agav. Let's explain the difference. Agav is a simultaneous kinyan, meaning, let's say I buy a property. I buy all the movable items that are on the property. They're included in the sale. It doesn't happen a second later. It happens at the same time. I'm buying movable items together with permanent items.
Only movable at that time. Like if it needs to be mined out, then. Right?
Well, then if it's in the mind, then that's called real estate at that point. So if I buy a warehouse that's full of stuff, I buy both things at once.
Yeah.
I buy the property and the stuff inside together. Agav means as an aside. So as an addition to acquiring the property, as an aside, I also acquire the stuff that's in the property. That's very different than chotzer. Chotzer is after the fact. I already own the property. Now I can acquire whatever falls into my property. Now, let's say the item was in my property even beforehand. I would still acquire it, but a second later. So for example, let's say I buy a house and then after I buy a house, I realize that there was a nest of chicks in the house. So I now own those chicks after the fact. Because, in other words, let's explain here. This is a major distinction also. It's very important to understand here. Let's say I'm buying the warehouse from Eric, right? A warehouse with wine in it. The whole warehouse is filled with wine. Eric is selling me both items. He's selling me the wine and he's selling me the property. And I'm getting the property together with the wine. Or to be more accurate, I'm getting the wine together with the property. The property is the main transaction. The wine is what we call agav. It's as an aside, I also got what's inside. But that in this case, we have a seller and a buyer. You are what we call a makna. A makna means you are providing your items for sale, right? And I am a kaina, I'm acquiring from you. That's very distinct though from a scenario where I have chicks on the property. I buy a field. Okay, turns out there's a whole bunch of nests with chicks in them. You're not selling me those chicks. Let's say, for example, you didn't even know those chicks are there. You're not selling them to me. You don't even own them. Okay, when I buy it. Now I have kinyan chotzer. If I walk in the field and I see the chicks there, I can say, "Oh, you know what? I want the chick. My field should acquire it."
But you don't have to pay anything.
But my field can acquire it now.
Your field can acquire it now. Okay.
Instead of the difference between two types of kinyanim, agav has a seller and a buyer. The seller provides both the movable items together with the real estate. Kinyan chotzer is a little more complicated than that because kinyan chotzer happens after the fact. After I already acquire the field, then anything that's in the field I can acquire through chotzer.
Okay, here's another example. When you buy a house, the refrigerator and the stove come with the house. It's all part of the deal. And then when the people leave, they leave the dining room table and they leave, I don't know, the break front and a couple of other things. That's kind of the
I think that would be a good example. So I would say that in the contract you stipulated to acquire, usually the stipulation to acquire the fridge. So then that would be included in the contract via agav. And the stuff they leave behind, that would be chotzer because that wasn't stipulated. Yeah, that would be a good example.
But do you have to? Okay, so in this,
agav must be stipulated, of course.
Okay, it does. Okay,
Yeah,
because
or it has to be blatantly obvious.
right, because I'm not used to in a scenario where you would buy a house and then someone would come back to you later and say, "Hey, I left my fridge there. I'd like you to rent that from me." You know?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, so Rav Zera Kibla. Rav Zera accepted this resolution. Rav Abba like Kibla. Rav Abba was not happy with this resolution. In other words, the resolution that it was not Kinyan Chotzer was Agav. Amarava Shaper Ovid like Kibla. Rav Abba was correct for not accepting the resolution. Why not? Did they not have a sudder to? Okay, so what's the suggestion here? Rabbi Gamliel here is looking to do a long distance Trumas and Meisters here, right?
Mhm.
Well, there's another option. What can you do when you sell your chametz to the rabbi? What do? He often gives you either a pen or a small cloth, tells you to pick it up and to sell him your chametz through picking up the cloth. That's called chalipin. Why couldn't he sell them the meiser by chalipin? He should have given them a cloth. And by picking up the cloth, they will acquire the meiser. Elawat, Toivas and all, Aina Maman Liktis Man Machalipin, Hachanami Toivas and all, Aina Maman Liktis Niklas Agabe Karka. So let's explain the distinction here. When you pick up the cloth, Trumas and Meisters, let's say the Meister goes to a Levi. What does the Gamliel own in that Meister? He doesn't own the Meister, it belongs to the Levi. What does he own? He owns the right to choose the Levi. This right is called Toivas and all. Meaning the right to get a favor from the Levi, because the Levi knows that you are his benefactor. Sorry?
Yeah, benefactor.
Benefactor. You're his benefactor. That's called Taivas and all. So perhaps Taivas and all is not really something that could be acquired by Chalipin. And just like it can't be acquired by Chalipin, it can't be acquired by Agav either. So it must have been acquired by Kinyan Chotzer. Okay, so Gemara says, "V'lohi," it's not true. Matanas kahuna netzinik sivben. The gifts of kahuna, this would be the things like the gifts of Meiser. The Torah says you have to give it. Chalipin, the law of Chalipin, using a cloth to acquire something, derech mekach memkahu. That is the manner of a sale, of selling something. And therefore it does not work for giving gifts of kahuna. Chalipin would not work. However, agav mekarka and esina alimtihi. But agav would work, because that's considered a gift. That is a legitimate way of transacting a gift. And Rav Abba was incorrect. Rav Papa says, is another major distinction here. Even if you'll concede the point that Rav Gamliel was using Kinyan Chotzer, there's two types of Kinyan Chotzers. This is what I was trying to bring out when we discussed Agav. There's Kinyan Chotzer when there is a buyer and a seller, and it's Kinyan Chotzer from Hefker, from what's ownerless, like chicks, or deer with broken legs. They're obviously ownerless. It's different category. Da'asachar is maknoitz and shiny. If there's a seller who's providing the item for sale, that's a different category. We know tamer. How do we know this? The time we learned raw ice and rotzen achar mציעא. We'll go through this Gemara in detail in a second. But the guy is chasing after the deer with the broken leg. It's a scenario where the guy who's chasing the deer. 1 second. Okay. The scenario is that somebody's chasing the deer. The owner is standing in the field, and the owner is able to chase down the deer before they leave his property. Obviously, this is a pretty slow-moving deer because he has a broken leg. That's the only way in which the owner can acquire either the chicks or the deer. He's able to chase them before and capture them before they leave his property. Ubay Rav Yomi says, "Matana ha'ech." What's the story with a gift? Meaning, let's say I decide to gift my deer to Eric. So I put my deer in his field. Eric's standing in the field. Eric says, "My field should acquire the deer." Now, deer is running through the field. Must it be the case that Eric is able to chase the deer and catch it before it leaves the field? If I'm giving a gift. So if it's Hefker, so the Gemara says, Kibba minei Rabbi Abba bar Kahana. Rabbi Abba bar Kahana accepted that there was such a distinction. Alf b'shurot zachrein ve'ein magian. My time, alive, mishunadas acheres maknois and shiny. So let's explain. Again, so if the deer is ownerless, and Eric wants to acquire it using his field with the deer with the broken leg, so Eric must be able to chase after the deer and capture it before the deer leaves his field. However, if the deer is being given to him as a gift, it is not necessary that he be able to capture the deer. Clearly, there's a distinction here between whether there's a seller who's selling the deer, we call das acheres makna. There's a makna, there's somebody who's selling it, who's an independent part of this discussion. He's not just the one, not besides for the acquirer, there's also a seller. And in the scenario where you're acquiring something from Hefker. So this is where Rav Papa drew a distinction. Rav Papa, so Rav Simi says to Rav Papa, hare get, look at a divorce. The das acharas maknaisa. In a divorce, there's a gifter of the divorce, right? The husband is giving the divorce to his wife. V'amar Ula, and Ula says, v'husha amedis b'tzad beisa. And that in order for the divorce to work, if you throw the divorce into the woman's field that's unsecured, she must be standing in the field. Now, why does she need to be standing there? It's das acharas makna. Somebody else is giving the item. And just like we're saying that if somebody gives the item, you can acquire it even if the field is not secured. Why by divorce is different? So the Gemara says, "Shine get to Isabel Karcha." Get is different because the husband can divorce his wife against her will. Okay, now the Gemara really disputes this, and let's really begin. Let's just point that out before we continue. Let's explain what's das acharas makna here. That the idea of das acharas makna is that there's a certain threshold of agency, of participation in a transaction, right? In the case where you're acquiring an item from Hefker, from ownerlessness, the threshold for participation is completely on the side of the acquirer. Fair enough? However, when there's a buyer and a seller, the threshold for participation is lower. Why? Because the seller is a participant in a transaction. So the agency necessary to be exercised over the item in question to be acquired is somewhat split between the buyer and the seller. Right? Now, let's imagine that in this case, the seller could force the trade through. Like a divorce. Like a divorce, the seller, effectively, the giver, which is the husband, can force. That means that the seller is a greater participant than the buyer. The buyer requires an even lower threshold of activity. When we're the seller, or we're the case of the husband, can push the divorce on her, or in the case of the seller, on the buyer. So that means that the buyer's participation, the participation necessary for the kinyan, is invoked or is actuated by the seller. Right? Think of a kinyan as an expression of desire for the item, in following a certain set of rules. Now, that desire can be expressed by the buyer. It could also be expressed in the inverse by the seller. And if the seller could force the transaction through, clearly he's able to express more of that kinyan. And the threshold of acquisition for the buyer is now lower. So the Gemara points out, if you can divorce a woman against her will, and she still has to be standing next to the field, then clearly, if you required her participation, for sure she would have to be standing next to the field. In other words, if in divorce scenarios where the husband could force his wife into a divorce, she must be an active participant, and she must be standing next to the field. So for sure, if I'm giving a gift where I require the buyer's voluntary participation, for sure he must be standing next to the fields.
So physical proximity is being apart in that way.
So that sort of ensures the field is secured,
So
and that allows the field to acquire it on your behalf.
So back to a question about Meiser. That's the question we're asking, right? Is whether he can make that, you call it kinyan, or what do you call that?
So Rav Papa is proposing that the story of Rabbi Gamliel is not relevant to acquiring an item from Hefker.
Oh,
Because of Das Acheres Makna, because a buyer and a seller have different laws than acquire from Hefker. Okay, let's continue here. So four lines on the bottom of the page. Now 3 lines. if a divorce which can be enacted against the will of a woman requires her participation in kinyan chotzer, so certainly if you're acquiring something from somebody else, you should also require their participation. Effectively, this is a monkey wrench into Rav Papa. Rav Papa is proposing that when do you require active participation in kinyan chotzer? That's only when you acquire from hefker. When you acquire as a gift, you don't need that level of participation. And the Gemara is pointing out, but by a divorce you do, and a divorce which can be done against the woman's will you do, for sure by a gift you should. So actually everything should be really in the same category. In order for kinyan chotzer to work, you should require the person in question, the acquirer in question, to be standing next to the fields. Okay, El Omer Rashi. So Rashi proposes Chotzer is Rabbi Mishum Yad V'loy Gora Mishlichos. Very, very interesting idea here. Chotzer is included because of Yad, because it's an extension of a person's hand, but it also isn't worse than Shlichos, than acting as a messenger. Okay, so let's explain here. By a divorce, okay, you must, let's explain. A field is both an extension of your hand and it's your agent. Okay, now, can an agent who was not appointed by the woman accept a get on behalf of a woman? An unappointed agent. No. Why not?
It's got nothing to do with it.
Because of the agents.
Mhm.
Right. And not only that, let's say, can an unappointed agent acquire $1 million for the woman? Of course. Why? Because presumably she wants that. Presumably he can act as her agent. This idea is called Zachan La'adam Shalei B'fanav. You can acquire good things for people even because it's a presumption they want you to act as their agent. But you can't acquire things they wouldn't want, like a divorce, because there's no such presumption. So therefore, by divorce, the law of Chotzer must act as yad, as an extension of your hands. We're together? In order for your hand to work, you have to be present. You have to be cognizant that it's in your hands. You have to be standing next to the field. However, with regard to the laws of transactional relationships, you want to acquire something. I'm giving Eric a gift of my deer. So then Eric's field can act as his agent without his own participation. Just like any agent can acquire a deer for Eric. Who wouldn't want some good venison, right? Presumably Eric wants a deer. So therefore, any agent can acquire the deer on his behalf, even without Eric's appointment. Together? So the reason why divorce is more stringent with regard to the fact that the woman must be present is because there the property is acting as the woman's hand, as an extension of her hand. Unlike the scenario of a gift, where the property is not acting as a hand, it's acting as a presumptive agent, using the idea called zachan. And if the gift is being given, there's a presumption of agency that is handed over to the agent. Okay. Okay, now let's wrap it up to the mission here. Gufa. This is a bit of a difficult Gemara today. Gufa. Rois and Ratsanachar Metzia. You see the two people chasing after the object. This goes back to the Mishnah. So they're running after the deer. The deer has a broken leg. One guy's chasing it. The owner of the property is in the property, sees the event happening, and he wants it to be his. It must be that the owner of the property there, remember, he's acquiring it from what's effectively ownerless. Nobody owns the deer. The owner of the property is able to chase the deer with the broken leg and catch it before it leaves his property. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, what's the story with the gift? Let's say I'm gifting my deer to Eric. Does the same rule apply? There is no requirement that Eric be able to chase down the deer before it leaves the property. Then we finish the Gemara with an interesting scenario. Boy Rava had an interesting question. So think of it as a house, right? You think of this is a good example, right? We have multiple windows in this room. A guy throws something. Imagine that all the windows are open. He throws something from one window and it flies out the other window. Right, expensive item, and it's in Kesser during its airborne trajectory. Can you acquire it while it's airborne in your own property? But it's going to be leaving the property. It's on a trajectory to leave. It's in one window, out the other one. But the guy wants to acquire it while it's flying. Do you acquire it or not? If it's in the ear and it's not going to land there, do we consider it kimunach dami as if it rested, as if it landed in the property, aloi or not? A bunch of people, one of these people told Rava, and this is like the Mishnah, Royce and Rotz and Achar Metzia. In other words, you have the deer running through the property. The Gemara presumes that the deer, let's say, is no different than, imagine a guy has a property that's on a hill, right? And there's this big ball of gold rolling through the hill. And Rav Yirmiyah says that if it's hefker, then you have to be able to catch it before it leaves. If it's a gift, you don't need to be able to catch it. In other words, even if while it's rolling, you can say, I want to acquire it, and even though it will roll out of your property, it's still yours. Even if it's rolling, and you'll never reach it, if it's a gift, you can still acquire it. So presumably, if the item flying through the windows is ownerless, you would not be able to acquire it. If it's being given as a gift, then you would be able to acquire it, even though it's flying out of the second window. It's going to be leaving the house on the same airborne trajectory.
Do you have to do it while it's in midair?
So the guy says, well, it's midair. Oh, I want to keep that. I want my field to acquire it.
Keep that.
My house to acquire it. So Amalei misgalgal kammer, misgalgal shiny misgalgal kimunach dami. There's a difference between rolling and an airborne trajectory. If it's a rolling down your hill, we consider that kimunach dami as if it's in your property and you can acquire it while it's rolling. However, if it's flying through your property, that's a different category. That was the question that Rav asked. Let's just finish the Mishnah. Metzias b'noi ubite haktanim. The lost object of a man's son or daughter that are children, or metzias avdei v'shifchasi haknanim, if his slave or maidservant that were indentured, they're permanent slaves, or metzias ishtay, or if his wife, chances upon a lottery ticket, harei elushalai, they belong to the husbands, to the owner of the slaves, to the father of the kids. We'll explain each one why this is the case. Metzias b'noi bite hagdalim. Let's say that the children are adults, or metzias avdim shechasei he'ivrim, or the slave are Jewish slaves, so you don't really own them permanently. Or metzias ishta shegersha, or if his wife who he divorced finds an expensive object, wins the lottery, alf b'shalonas and ksuba, even though he didn't pay it a ksuba to her, they belong to them. The husband, father does not own them. Okay. See you tomorrow. Good day.
Tomorrow regular time.
Yes, it'll be nice again.
Is there a regular time?